Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of Sprout Sessions. I'm Sarah Nagel. I'm the Senior Manager of Brand Advocacy and Community here at Sprout, and I'll be your host for this session on crisis management tips for brands. So, the goal of Sprout Sessions is really just to bring our industry together and arm and inspire all of you with insights that make you want to take action with your own social strategy and help you to gain new perspectives. A few things to note: these sessions will be recorded and they'll be live on our YouTube page, so you can access them immediately following this presentation. We'd love for you to engage with us on social media. Please tweet any takeaways with the hashtag Sprout Sessions. This is a digital conference, so feel free to network accordingly. Lastly, this session is only about 20 minutes long, but we'll spend the last 10 minutes doing Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions to the chat panel at the right of your YouTube screen throughout the presentation. Now, let's get this session started. Allow me to pass it over to Andrew Caravella from our own Sprout Social to introduce himself and get this started. Andrew?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm so happy that you guys asked me to do this, and welcome everybody. I hope that you're finding all of these Sprout sessions informative and enjoyable, and we're really proud of what we're bringing to you today and all week, really. But thank you for joining us. So the title of the presentation and sort of the talk that I'm going to give in the next 20 or 30 minutes is really about crisis management. And when the team and I were putting this together, we really were thinking through several different sort of topics and ideas and ways to go about this. And what we really kind of came up with, and I hope to express to you guys today, is a bit of a framework or a thought process around crisis management. I think there's a lot of conversations that take place, and there's a lot of thought process around, for marketers and communicators, what happens when something goes wrong or when something blows up and becomes a bigger deal than maybe you thought it would be. And so if you think about sort of this idea of offense and defense, and in reality, this could have even been titled "The Best Defense is a Good Offense." I mean, I think it's a little bit interchangeable. But what I want to go through today is a bit about that. First, just a little bit about me. Sarah introduced me, but I've been at Sprout for about 5 years. I'm currently the Vice President of Strategy and Brand Engagement. So I work with a lot of our customers and our community around everything from, topics and themes and brand trends to working with our customers and really making sure that people are utilizing our platforms as best as they can, but also that we're able to have conversations and advance the sort of the social media discipline in a great way. In terms of the conversation today, what I wanted to cover, and the way I framed it out is through a few different lenses or a few different components. The first is just to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a crisis and what constitutes a crisis. So I'll go through a little bit of my thoughts on those, and hopefully you'll have some questions or some thoughts of your own. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the influence in social and what social as a communication channel and as a platform does in when a crisis becomes part of something that your brand needs to deal with. I'm going to dissect the role of social and sort of where and how it can play into managing a crisis. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with a few sort of steps and reminders about your own social crisis management plans and some considerations you should be thinking through. So if you think about a crisis, these are some old school newspaper headlines around some of the bigger crises in the last several decades. And if you think about a crisis, as for what it is, a lot of times there's a few sort of resounding components that appear in many different kinds of crises. And whether it's, Nixon resigning, which is a huge sort of global crisis, whether it's the Tylenol scare from several years ago, whether it's holding companies accountable for something like an oil spill. There's a lot of things that can constitute a crisis. Usually they involve things like a broad impact, a negative reaction, potentially something that harms or causes confusion with consumers or with customers, especially as we talk about brand crises. And what's happened in the modern day and in the last several, 5-10 years as social has come to the fold, is that the way in which, I use these 3 examples from newspaper headlines for a very express purpose. Previously, and for so long, crises sort of unfolded at a bit of a slower pace. And the big point I want to make about crises in this day and age, which I'm sure you all can attest to, is that things can spiral out of control very, very quickly. And so time is always of the essence when it comes to crisis management. And it's something I want us to consider as we talk through the session today, and as you think about your own plans and being prepared for crises, knowing that it's not the days of sort of slow news cycles and a controlled message. It really can move rather quickly. And the other thing that's really important about crises, sort of as you think about what they are and the makeup of them, is that they really ring true across channels. So as marketers and communicators, I think we're constantly thinking about, the messages we put forth into the world about our business or about our brand or our products. And if anything goes wrong, where might that, come to bear? And the reality is social is just one of the channels where crisis can happen. It certainly has some effects that are unlike any other channels, which we'll get into. But as a marketer and as business people, you really need to think about all the different channels that may be affected when something happens, both in the lead up to maybe something bubbling up and becoming an issue, certainly to when a crisis hits and there may be an issue that you need to address very immediately, and also in sort of the aftermath and in the follow up. How you and your businesses tackle sort of a multi-channel approach to crisis management is really important and something we want to be thinking about. The other thing I should say before we dive into some of the social components is that, crises, I think, in a lot of our minds tend to be something that's very, very negative or very dire. And certainly that is one instance of a crisis. But really, it can take a lot of different forms. And for your brand or your business, something may go wrong that might seem minor to another brand or business. But for you, it is a crisis. Or for your executives, it's a crisis. So really thinking about not only across channels where things ring true, and a crisis may happen, but across your business and what a crisis means to you, and doing that planning to think about what could potentially go wrong is a step that not all businesses take, and it's something that everyone should do well in advance of anything happening. So I wanted to go through, now that we talked a little about what a crisis is, and I'm sure it's a pretty familiar concept for many of you, I wanted to go through and outline 3 areas where I think social really makes a difference when it comes to crises. And I'm going to give you a few examples of them as well. And many of you have probably seen some of these examples, but hopefully we can talk about them in the context of this topic. And the first thing to me that I've really found to be true is that social democratizes influence. And by that, I mean, whether you're a celebrity with millions of followers or you're an individual with a few hundred, the ability for your message to pick up steam or for whatever crisis may occur through social, it gives everybody kind of that even playing field and even ability to make an impact, both good and bad, to bring something to bear and to light that may not be positive or may in fact be a crisis. And so I wanted to share an example of sort of some interesting, an interesting crisis of late. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. I'm sure you have, but this whole concept of people eating Tide Pods, which I think is just bizarre in and of itself, but certainly a crisis for the Tide brand, right? And on the left, we've got a couple different examples of a few tweets. And and what's interesting about this conversation and the crisis that's happening with this is that, first and foremost, I mean, it's a public health crisis and it's something that's very dangerous for people. So there's a very immediate need to address it. But even more so on the left, what you see is, a Twitter user, Megan, sort of tweeting, an Oprah GIF, me eating, Tide laundry detergent pods. And you'll see that got an insane number of retweets and likes and sort of a huge amplification through just a regular Twitter user. By the same token, the artist Halsey also tweeted about it, sort of the same concept and the same topic, and got about, a little bit more, but about equal, or at least, within the same realm of volume of retweets and likes and so on and so forth. So this fact that social kind of can democratize the impact that a given individual may have is something to be really considerate of when you're thinking about crisis management. And obviously, just as an example of some of the response techniques and mechanisms that Tide has put in place, they are taking this very seriously. They're thinking about the fact that, there's some health concerns with this. It's not just sort of a benign crisis. It's something that could be very serious for people's health. So they're really actively engaging and sharing information around poison control and what to do if you have ingested that. But besides that, the first point I wanted to make around social is this idea of democratization and making it so much and so easy for people to really kind of have a voice and contribute to a crisis conversation on social. The second point I wanted to make around social when it comes to crisis is this idea that it can really fuel brand chaos. And by that, I mean, so much can happen so quickly. And for many of you who are social managers or marketers or people on the, mining your inboxes day in and day out, you understand that conversations and comments can come at you from all sides. They can include not just your brand, but other brands. It can kind of lead to this very chaotic, quick moving conversation. And certainly, like I mentioned in the beginning, gone are the days of sort of 24 48-hour news cycle. This stuff is happening instantaneously. And in the example that I'm showing, I wanted to bring forward. Many of you probably heard about the Grab Your Wallet campaign, which is a campaign that's basically inciting people to boycott certain brands based on political views and so on and so forth. And so what's interesting about this singular example is, as we did some search results around the hashtag Grab Your Wallet, is that what you see is a lot of different brands being involved in the conversation, and it's a very chaotic conversation that continues for days, if not weeks. What's interesting to note about this, and a tip for all of you who are managing social conversations, is that users sometimes, as you'll see here, they're at mentioning certain brands like Macy's or Zappos. In other instances, they're talking about Sam's Club or Costco, and they're not at mentioning. So really, this idea of social listening and sort of understanding the chaos that's playing out is critical. So again, using not only social media management tools, but the social listening and tools and techniques to make sure that you can capture the conversations that you need to. You can understand that if your business is being targeted in an instance like this, or if it's a category or a vertical crisis that's happening to you and your competitors, how can you have those conversations? Certainly using hashtag monitoring and other things like that helps you kind of get a hold of what's going on. But really understanding and knowing that chaos may exist is something, as you prepare for crises, to be mindful of and thinking through how you'll be able to handle that. The third sort of component I wanted to talk through and sort of a framework for thinking about crises when it comes to social is the idea of it increasing accountability. And I think this is really important for many of you who manage handles for your brands. You probably are aware of the fact that on social, people take brands to task and they hold people accountable based on what's going on or what's happening. And certainly in the instance of a crisis, they're going to want answers and resolution pretty quickly. And so this idea of accountability can be critical in terms of what you're able to manage and what you need to do to respond. And in this example, this is another recent example from the last couple of months. Many of you might be aware that H&M was selling a volatile T-shirt that had a picture of a monkey on it with an African-American boy. And so obviously there's some sensitivities around that kind of a promotion. And it actually caused, in this case, them to close some stores temporarily in South Africa due to some protests from a group called the Economic Freedom Fighters. So again, here's a crisis that sort of definitely moved across channels, but really held the company accountable for what it did and for the chaos that ensued as a result, largely driven by social. So again, I've given you a few different examples and sort of a few different thoughts around the impact that social makes when it comes to crises. So hopefully, as you guys think through your own crisis plans and some ideas, which we'll get into in a second, you're really thinking about social as a core communication channel. Because what we're finding, and this is an interesting stat, many of you might be aware of the data that we typically produce, and we produce on a quarterly basis, called the Sprout Social Index. This is a stat from one of our recent indexes that basically said 46% of consumers have actually called out a brand on social. Now that's not necessarily, and when it comes to millennials, that's 56%. So the likelihood that people will take to social to take you to task or call you out, maybe as a result of a crisis, but maybe as a result of some sort of issue that becomes a crisis. So the likelihood, as you think about what you need to be doing to manage the conversations, just know that we're finding the propensity for people to take active voices on social and take brands to task continues to rise. So I want to talk in the next several minutes a little bit about dissecting the role of social media. And for me, as I was putting this talk together and talking with our team, I wanted to outline 3 components and give you some suggestions and some takeaways on how to deal with each of them. And I think it's important, as all of you are facing and preparing in advance, hopefully, for a potential crisis, to ask yourself some questions. And not only ask yourself a question, but to ask your team some questions. And these are the 3 ones that I've identified. There are more, and there's a larger conversation certainly to be had around crisis management. But for the sake of this short presentation, I wanted to focus on these 3. The first one is, did the crisis begin on social media? So as we think about it, was the impetus for the crisis, or did it sort of bubble up starting on social? Or was it from other channels or from another instance and just, did it become amplified on social, which is the second question. And again, the ability of things to go viral and for conversations to take hold and for mass amounts of people to get involved and amplify a crisis is very real on social. And then the third question is, can this crisis be resolved on social media? Can we use social as a communication channel to quell people's hesitations, or to answer questions, or to resolve things that maybe got out of hand, potentially on social or potentially on other channels? And so as you think about your own plans, and we'll go through a few questions to ask on all of these, having this internal dialogue with yourselves and your teams is going to be critical to developing your plan. So again, knowing when and where to use social. It may be that in a lot of instances, you're going to have to take a multi-channel approach to managing a crisis. You're not just going to be able to do it on one channel alone. So if a crisis begins on social, I wanted to just outline a few of the things that we've thought through and we would recommend you do. And this is, again, to some of you, it might be rudimentary, but hopefully it sets a framework for others to really take advantage of pre-planning in this regard. But if you see something bubbling up and something happens on social, I think it's really critical to notify and involve all the appropriate stakeholders. And that may be that they don't even work or deal with social media in their day-to-day jobs, but within the organization, it's important that they're aware. It's critical that you act fast, yet with a certain sense of prudence with your initial responses. I don't advocate sort of just trying to resolve an entire crisis with one tweet. You have to think about, certainly timeliness and acknowledging an issue, acknowledging fault, which is the second point if there was something that was done wrong. But managing that and balancing that with a sense of this may be a longer ongoing conversation. What can we do to not only monitor it, as I suggest here, but also kind of keep it in control or keep it in check? So those are just some questions and some things to think about if a crisis actually begins on social, and that's the first place you notice it. These things also can obviously apply to crises of all kinds, but it's something that's particularly important on social. But if a crisis is being amplified on social, whereas maybe it started somewhere else, or maybe it's picking up steam and social kind of becomes this core channel where it's gaining momentum, you really need to be mindful of that coordination across other channels. That could be other social channels. If something starts on Twitter, and being mindful of what's happening on Facebook and Instagram and others is important, but certainly across other channels like your website or your review sites or things like that, being mindful of where you need to be monitoring and who needs to be involved to rectify the situation or to answer questions is critical. The other thing to think about as a crisis is being amplified is you're probably going to get questions and conversations that maybe you didn't expect, but highlighting and identifying some of those approved responses that answer a question in totality, and then pinning them in a place where people can see them and make it aware that you are taking action and that you're responsive is crucial. So as things are being amplified, being able to say, we have this under control, we're aware of the situation, we're doing what we can to make it better for you. Highlighting those posts and pin tweets and pin posts and stuff is really critical and a great way to kind of keep things under control. And lastly, we say this about everything, but it's especially true in a crisis. As that amplification continues, being able to engage and to respond to individuals, both publicly and privately where you need to, is critical, because that will help them not a resolution is in place, but also potentially help them or stop them from further amplifying it because they feel satisfied with the response that you've given them. So again, things to think about if that amplification component is really kind of taking on new life. And lastly, this idea of conflict and crisis resolution on social. I think this is something maybe not everyone thinks about quite as much, but this idea of being as you've gotten the situation under control, being transparent about what happened. The truth is very powerful, and being upfront and truthful about what may have happened and what you did, not only to solve it, but the actions you're taking to rectify whatever repercussions there were, is important. Thanking people, for their feedback and for their patience and for being there with you as you've dealt with an issue is something that's critical. Certainly it depends on the issue and their patience level of what they were able to give you, but thinking about, again, that trust and that loyalty that you've undoubtedly built up through the years. If something bad does happen, or something that causes some irk for your customers or community, hopefully if you have some of these mechanisms in place and deal with it appropriately, they'll be patient and they'll be responsive to it. And also share lessons. If you think about this as being a learning experience, depending on what the crisis was, share the steps that you're going to take to avoid those situations in the future and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. That communication component is critical and crucial. So as we wrap up and head into questions, I know this was a brief session, but I wanted to just sort of give you a few considerations that I think are really important as you create a plan. For those of you that have one, I commend you. I hope you've never had to use it. For those of you that don't have a plan, I encourage you to think about some of these things when you make one. Certainly thinking about the guidelines for identifying a type or a magnitude of a crisis. As I said in the beginning, crises can be very different for different brands and different businesses, but identifying as a collective group, an organization, what are the things that could go wrong for you and your business, and identifying how big or how bold you would need to be to address them is critical. Second, about roles and responsibilities. Who on your teams will be responsible for doing certain things in the event of a crisis? Whether that's on social, whether that's extending into other marketing components, but really having a clear definition of who those people are and what their responsibilities are will make all sort of response tactics that much smoother and go that much more easily. Third, thinking about the materials and the messaging that you would need and an approval process to do so. So if you can create potential responses in advance and have them ready to go, knowing that you'll need to tweak them certainly based on what happens, but knowing who also needs to approve them to get them out the door immediately. That could go for draft tweets and draft Facebook posts, but it could also go to other messaging outside of social. And lastly, just this idea of general internal communications plan. A lot of times we think about the external components first and what our communities and our social communities need to be aware of and to get sort of the message out to the public. But at the same time, really thinking about the internal communications plan. Who in your organization needs to be informed? How do people need to know what's going on? Whether that's customer success people, whether that's customer support people, all those that could be on the front lines as well. Educating them internally is going to be huge to make sure that you can manage and respond to a crisis appropriately. So that's really what I have prepared. Hopefully, like I said, it was a brief session, but it gave you some things to think about and some ideas when it comes to crisis management. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you. I know we're monitoring for questions, and hopefully we've got.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Andrew. Those were some really essential takeaways for crisis management, and we really appreciate all the examples too. I love the perspective that crises aren't necessarily always dire, that they can really come in so many shapes and forms, so I appreciate that you addressed that too. Folks, welcome to the next 10 minutes of questions. And remember that you can access a recording of this session following this Q&A. So with that, we have quite a few questions from YouTube. Andrew, as you know, crises can sometimes stir up from trolls, and we had quite a few questions come in, including ones from John Venon and from Alessandra Garrow in regards to addressing trolls and how whether you find it prudent or not to allow your followers and advocates to respond to those trolls. Do you think that that's a good practice to follow?
That's a really good question, Sarah. Thank you guys for bringing it up. I think, trolls and sort of people who are just out to quote unquote make trouble and sort of exacerbate an issue certainly do exist. What I would say and my recommendation would be, the first time that they contact you and there maybe sort of have a valid issue or a valid concern in response to a crisis, to address it in a way that's relevant and respectful of what they're saying. As they continue to sort of potentially tweet at you or post at you and kind of become a bit more like we've seen sort of trollish in their behavior, I think it's really up to your discretion to decide how you want to handle it. If you don't see a positive result coming out of continuing to engage with them, I do think it's well within your rights to kind of let that hopefully maybe die down on its own, or not respond, or sort of try to maybe take a conversation private and sort of really get at their true issue, because there are people that kind of want to continue to stir up trouble. And I don't think that that's a productive use of anyone's time. And certainly, in context of having to address a lot of other issues from non-trolls, making sure that you have the bandwidth to address the people you really need to address.
That's really great advice. Yeah, definitely want to focus on those folks who do either love your business or a customer, as opposed to the people who are just there to stir up trouble.
Yep.
Taking it a step back a little bit, we had a question from Ann Christensen, and she asked, how soon do you think that you need to follow up to a crisis on social? And we actually had another question that I think plays in really well here. They had asked, if a crisis happens on a specific channel, let's say Instagram, for example, is it necessary to respond just on Instagram, or should you make statements on your other social platforms as well? And that came in from Caitlin Griffith from YouTube. What do you think, Andrew?
Awesome. Those are great questions too. I think, when it comes, I'll answer the second question first. When it comes to um, sort of multiple channels, I think certainly you need to start with the channel where it came from, right? And sort of address it there. I do think you should have, if you think about sort of social as a collective, if you know that there are communities and there are people within your communities that are present on all of your different channels, it might make sense to post, a little bit about it just to sort of preempt any additional conversation or fodder. In some instances, maybe you'll write a blog post sort of talking about the resolution or sort of the issue. Maybe it's wise to kind of point people to a certain centralized location for your messaging on resolving it. I think that can be a great way to kind of show that you're thinking through your presence in totality, which I think is a really good thing. And now I'm going to ask you, I'm sorry, I just blanked. Can you repeat that first question?
Yeah, Ann Christensen from YouTube had asked, how soon should you be following up to a crisis on social?
Right. So this is kind of what I mentioned at the beginning. I think it's really important to respond very quickly and very immediately. However, only if you have the right information. And in some instances, responding quickly means just acknowledgement, saying, we hear you, we know this is an issue, we're working with XYZ channels or with XYZ people to address it. We will continue to monitor it, we'll continue to update. I think sometimes people jump to this idea of the need to resolve. And certainly that's the end goal. But in some cases, that immediate acknowledgement is what gives people peace of mind to know that you're addressing it and it will come to a resolution quickly or as soon as possible. So being mindful of that difference is critical, but certainly not letting things go silent for certainly if you can respond in a matter of minutes to acknowledge, that's fantastic. But certainly, well within an hour would be ideal, I think.
Definitely. I think we see a lot of examples of brands maybe waiting a little bit too long to acknowledge it, like you suggested. They're just waiting for the right information. But I love your perspective about really making sure that you're saying, we hear you, we understand, we're working on it. I think that that's so crucial to crisis management.
Right, because the other thing to note about that as a follow-up is if you provide wrong information or you're quick to respond with how you think something will happen or be resolved, and then it doesn't, you can kind of exacerbate the problem for yourself, which is not, no one wants that. So being able to sort of be balanced and nuanced in your responses, but knowing that it may take time and giving yourselves the time to do that.
Absolutely. So I know that you talked that crises take all different shapes and forms. And Stephanie Lewis from YouTube had asked if you have any tips on when you should leave it alone and let the crisis blow over, or how to know when it really is something that you need to address immediately. And working with an executive team who might see something and want to jump on it right away.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting point because crisis can be defined and mean very different things to very different people, even within your organization, right? So I think a few sort of just across the board things to think about. If there's obviously any sort of emergency or healthcare or anything that would harm something, it's very physical, emotional harm components that are very, if you think about some of the crises that we all are unfortunately experiencing in the world today, those true emergencies absolutely are needing to be addressed. When it comes to some of the more business crises or things around certainly products, things like recalls, other things like that, I mean, those are things that, again, if you wait too long to address are going to spiral out of control. So thinking through, what those possibilities could be, but also, as I said earlier, thinking through and having the conversations when nothing is wrong. On a random Tuesday, have a conversation and set a meeting with some of your leaders to say, okay, what could go wrong? How would we react to this? Where does this fall on a level of importance or intensity for us in terms of how we would need to deal with it? Because then it takes some of that volatility that happens in the moment out of the equation, and you're able to have a bit more of a prepared reaction when hopefully if it never does come, but if it does come, you're able to do that. Is that helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head. And as you said, the other title to this presentation could be the best. Is it defense is a good offense or offense?
I think they're completely interchangeable, right? I mean, that's the funny part about it. But the preparedness on both sides of the equation is I think what's important.
Definitely. So it looks like we have time for just one more question. There are a lot of great ones, though, coming in through YouTube. So I know that Andrew said that he wanted to follow up with them on social media. So Andrew, I'll let you do that via Twitter afterwards. But this last question comes from Tamco Building Products, and they asked, do you think that there's value to offering the truth when someone posts something that's blatantly untrue about your brand or your product? Do you think it's better to engage with that person and correct the information, or should you just leave it alone?
Oh, I mean, the truth will set you free, right? I always think it's important to tell the truth. I think, certainly the amount of misinformation that can appear on social is something that we all are aware of as marketers and social managers and all the folks that are hopefully listening. I think, standing up for your business and your whatever instance may be upon you, really sort of understanding what the situation is and being truthful about what happened, and sometimes that's not good, but acknowledging what happened, but also what you're doing to correct the problem, is critical. I think not at least acknowledging that the person has misspoke or is wrong or inaccurate, um, at least the first time, could be a detriment to sort of continuing the conversation and managing the crisis in totality. So I'm absolutely an advocate of telling and exposing the truth where you can.
Definitely, you want to get in there and talk to those people who are talking to your brand because they're taking the time to share that insight. So definitely valuable for
For
them.
sure. And if they care, if they're caring enough for most people, if they're caring enough to post or to have conversations or ask questions or be worried, I think we owe, as brands and businesses, we owe them the respect and sort of the due diligence to make sure that they're reacting and talking with accurate information.
Great point, Andrew. I think we can end it there. So thank you everyone so much for attending this session. Be sure to keep your eyes peeled. We'll share some of the major takeaways with you later on. You can definitely feel free to continue the conversation using the hashtag Sprout Sessions, and feel free to follow up with Andrew as well. His Twitter handle is listed right here on the slide. From all of us at Sprout, thanks for joining in.